Welcome everybody to our first Erasmus Mundus annual lecture. My name is Christian Tams. I'm a professor of international law at the University of Glasgow, and it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you here in the room and also people following us on Zoom. This annual lecture is the first of its kind. It's also part of a consolidation drive, you might say, a consolidation agenda for this Erasmus Mundus program that my colleague Asli Olcay and myself are directing, the ILGSPD, the Erasmus Mundus program with the most unwieldy acronym: International Law, Global Security, Peace and Development. It just flows. You should speak it more often than that. It's a wonderful degree program, as many of you in the audience know, because you're studying on it. It's a program run by the University of Glasgow with wonderful partners in Barcelona, in Luneburg, Leuphana, in Brussels, in Tartu, and in Nijmegen. It has wonderful staff teaching on it, and so far wonderful students studying towards it. And students are sent, for those who are not on this program, I might mention this, almost on a grand tour of Europe. They start in Glasgow, go to Barcelona, follow the weather, and then in the second year of the degree, they specialize in their so-called pathways in Germany, Luneburg, Belgium, Brussels, the Netherlands, Nijmegen, or Estonia, Tartu. Now, the ILGSPD, and see how effortlessly that can be pronounced, program aims to support students and enable them to look at careers in the international field, with international organizations, with NGOs, with governments, and prepare them to some extent for the challenges facing people working in an international environment. We're doing this, or hoping to do this, with a mixture of learnings and placements, focusing on law, on international relations, providing students with a bit of a tour of the issues that might arise. The program is in the second year of its existence. Many of you here are part of what we call the second cohort. Some of you following on Zoom are part of the first cohort, who are now in their second year and studying on their pathways. ILGSPD relies on a mix of options: classroom teaching, independent learning, independent research, placements, but also significantly on guest lecture events. This is a special one, which we've tried to signal by calling it the annual lecture, not just any lecture, the annual lecture. It's the first of its kind, and I'm delighted that you're all here. Also delighted because we have a wonderful first annual lecturer, but that is something that Asli will tell us about. Many thanks so far.
Thank you, Christian, for the introduction. Our speaker today is Jamie McGoldrick. Jamie has decades-long experience of working for the humanitarian sector, mainly with the United Nations. Most recently, he was the United Nations Humanitarian Coordinator in Palestine. Before that, he worked in Yemen, Nepal, and Georgia. He was also a Deputy Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process. Previously, Jamie held numerous positions outside of the United Nations as well. He's worked with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, the ICRC, and Save the Children in his long humanitarian career. He began his career as a news producer and researcher. He worked for the BBC, Sky TV, Channel 4, and Middle East Broadcasting. Currently, Jamie is semi-retired, as he calls it. He's from Glasgow, and he's returned to Glasgow after his work in Palestine. He still works on an ad hoc basis for the United Nations. He's also a distinguished fellow of the Institute of International Humanitarian Affairs at Fordham University. Today, Jamie will talk about his decades-long experience of the humanitarian sector, mainly within the UN. He'll tell us about what the UN's humanitarian architecture looks like from the inside. We know that he has exciting and eye-opening stories to tell, so we hope you enjoy this evening. Without further ado, I'll invite Jamie to the stage.
Yeah, good evening. It's a long time since I was in a lecture phase, so I can tell you. It's good to sort of be here with people of your age who are studying, law and legal issues and international relations, because I'm going to try and tell you what the reality is like, how it doesn't work the way you think it might. I grew up in Glasgow, the East End, and I came from Irish parents, so and I support Celtic, which is another issue. But anyway, and it's great to be here tonight to this Erasmus Mundus event, and thanks to Asli and to Christian for the kind words and introduction and the opportunity. I mean, I don't want you to see me some old guy who's sitting here going to tell you war stories, because it's not my interest. I mean, I would rather tell you about why we weren't able to achieve what we wanted to achieve because of politics and because of interference and because of the lack of respect for international law to humanitarian principles. And I want to go through a number of countries where I worked to show how that actually unfolded and what it meant for me as the head of the UN in those situations. But just to say that I left at the East End of Glasgow when Maggie Thatcher arrived, and politically because I couldn't stand it. So I then left and did VSO in Nigeria, and then from that, as I mentioned, I went to various organisations, started with Save the Children Fund, then went to International Red Cross, and then from that to the UN for the last 25 plus years. The UN is a very big bureaucracy. It's full of people who are a lot of civil servants, but there's a lot of people who are more interested in action or response. Have I worked for the most part of my career in situations of instability, including like Sierra Leone, Liberia, Bosnia, all times during the war, Somalia during the war. Before the Americans came, I was there. When the Americans arrived, Operation Restore Hope. And there's a joke for you to start with. And then I worked in Yemen and Palestine, but I also worked in a lot of natural disasters like the Pakistani earthquake 2005, and I was in Nepal when the earthquake struck in 2015. But we'll get to that. I mean, I preferred working in these unsettled environments because you can get things done quicker. The bureaucracy was less, the impact is quicker as well, and you can see what you're actually trying to do rather than development. But maybe just to say that, I mean, for those who don't know what humanitarianism is, it's a way of trying to, and it started in the mid-60s by Biafra in Nigeria, and it brought about the creation of things like Médecins Sans Frontières. And that's when this whole endeavour came. And from that has grown. It's become maybe more of an industry now, which I think is unfortunate. I mean, the original foundations, I don't think have kept up with the pace of changes that have taken place globally. And in that, I would say that, you know, the power imbalances in the world are not factored into how we do. We still think very purist about ourselves in terms of humanitarians. And I think we don't deal enough with parties who don't want to relinquish control, and including member states as well as, you know, local actors. The other thing that's happened, we have this Western prescribed notion of how we think a crisis should be addressed. It's a template, it's a preordained, and it's always failure, I think. And I would also say that the other thing is the increased presence of non-state actors. These are militia groups, these are rebel groups who have no interest in working with you other than to extract from you while you're there with health, material, with food, with shelter, whatever it might be. So I would also just flag, in the last 2 years that's happened, you've had the Myanmar crisis, the Afghanistan crisis, the Ukraine crisis, and what's happened in Afghanistan, what happened in, those crises here. And what I think they've done is they've challenged many parts of how we live and work, not just as humanitarians, but I think as a global community. And I think what's happened is that we carry out humanitarian response in a different way because of all these challenges. And I would say that it's undermined the respect for, I think, the international institutions, such as the UN, and I'll talk about that as well. I think there's also, these have also called into question a lot of the relevance of things like international legal frameworks and how you use them to try and safeguard or address the challenges of people on the ground. Maybe just to say that for me, that there are many principles by which we work, and I'll talk about some of them, but the fundamental one is humanity. And that's the one we should occupy ourselves by. But what we're there for is actually try and address the immediate needs of people who are caught up in a conflict or a crisis by delivering any kind of aid, protection, and do it in the accordance with principles such as neutrality, impartiality, and independence. And those words are easy to use, but they're very difficult to actually apply. I'll give you some examples of crises. We're going to talk about Yemen, we're going to talk about Nepal, an earthquake, and finish up in Palestine. And we'll ask some questions at the end. So, and if I'm going too long, fall asleep, pretend you're sleeping so that I know you mean. You know, the thing is, sometimes it's not you that prevents you from doing the work, it's others around you. Non-state actors, some key member states who want to interfere or block or not help or not fund what you're trying to do. I think there's a lack of respect and a lack of compliance of international law and humanitarian principles, and that's gotten worse in my years. It's gotten much, much worse. In the last 10 years, it's accelerated incredibly. And I think the crisis I just mentioned to you, the Ethiopias, the Ukraines, the Afghanistans, and the Myanmars, they've turned it into another dimension. And I think it's going to be very difficult for us to turn back from that. And I would say that, the humanitarian principles I mentioned to you, impartiality, independence, and neutrality, to me, they don't hold much water anymore. And I think we have to just accept that. And it's unfortunate. And I think what we end up doing is by being pragmatic. In a crisis, we start being pragmatic. And then what we do is we actually undermine and erode the value or the potency of those principles, because we sell them off to get funds. We sell them off to get access, because a non-state actor or a member state doesn't want us to do that. Right, in Yemen, I was the head of Yemen. And I'll maybe just give you a brief what Yemen is all about. Yemen created one of the world's biggest humanitarian disasters. 70 to 80% of the people needed assistance. About 8 million people were starving. There was a localized fighting in 2015 which broke into a full-blown war. And that was two sides pitched against each other. There was President Saleh, who was the previous deposed president, and then there was the Houthis, who came from the north looking for some respite because they'd been ignored for decades. And then you had the Saudi-led coalition, who were there to reimpose President Hadi back into power again. All fiction. All of it was fiction. It was never going to happen. And then what you had was, because of that, you had, as well as all those people getting really their suffering levels you cannot imagine. A weak state, fragmented even further. Infrastructure, meagre as it was destroyed or was being destroyed by the Saudis. Opened vast opportunities for terrorist-affiliated organisations to infiltrate that country and be there. And then what you had was a Saudi-led coalition. I don't know if you know the Saudi-led coalition. It was made up of the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, the UK and the US, plus others. But that was the four main parts of it. And it's interesting, they were allowed to come together because if you remember the nuclear deal done with Iran in 2015, the Saudis went mental when that was signed off for by the US. This was a way to appease them. Obama and the Security Council gave them a resolution 2216, which allowed them to say, we will bring back Hadi. We'll bring back the former president back there. And in order to do that, we'll bomb this country into the prehistoric times. And that's what they tried to do. So the pragmatism I mentioned earlier was this. We needed $2.5 billion a year to address the millions, I'm talking about 8 million people in dire need of food security, a massive 1.5 million people cholera outbreak. We needed funds. Where did we get the funds from? Saudi Arabia. So I had to go to Saudi Arabia and talk to these people and ask them for funds to address a crisis that I just left, which they had created and are creating and intensifying. And so the principles of neutrality and independence, they're watered down or disappeared. So that's what I'm talking about. And I said, so again, the politics become the shadow of all the work we do. And so this pragmatism is something we had to deal with. We had to have it at the forefront in order to get things done and save lives. That was the excuse we gave ourselves. Access to Yemen by air, by sea, or by road was controlled by the Saudi-led coalition. Inside Yemen, if I wanted to move trucks from X to Y, I had to phone Riyadh to ask them for permission to do that. And that's still the case to this day. It became a very politicized environment. And then what you had was this situation where you had, it's so monumentally unfair and cruel that, the people from the poorest country in the Middle East are pitted against this massive thrust of military hardware supported and backed by the US and by the UK, and many of your countries, member state governments funded, supported the military endeavour of Saudi Arabia in that situation. So some examples of what it all meant was that, like, you would go to a village after, like, there was bombings all day and all night. You're sitting at home or in the hotel, and the place was getting bombed. And I'm talking about not just the occasional bombing, I'm talking about serious bombing. So you would go to villages and you would find body parts, strewn across the street or against the wall, because it happened that night before. People scattered, they never cleaned the place up. Went to a funeral party. What happened was there was a very major incident inside Sana'a, the capital itself, where the Saudis got wind that many of the serious Houthi leaders would be at this funeral. So they bombed it. And it was a civilian funeral. And they killed 120 plus people. No one knew who died because I was there. I came later. They put a bunker busting bomb right through into the car park below, and the place just evaporated. So I went there to visit because I was the head of the UN. I had to go there and be seen to. I wrote a statement condemning it. I went there and there was a press conference, impromptu press conference, and I was sitting at the table. The guy brought me an arm, a dead man's arm here. So they instrumentalized me being there at that meeting. That was the Houthis. And then the Saudis tried to get me removed from making that statement, which was facts-based evidence to say this is where we were. And that was the environment we had to work in. And it was shameful. The other thing the Saudis did as well, they kept out all of the media, the Western media. No one was allowed in to come in there and see for themselves. Any pictures that came out there were from the Houthi or others. And then as soon as they came out, they said, oh, that's the Houthis' propaganda. It wasn't. And so under humanitarian law, parties to the conflict are supposed to let humanitarians, have unfettered access to populations in need. Saudi Arabia, the UK, the US, and these other peoples had no regard for it at all. That was it. So at any time we went and asked them, why can't you? There was always a myriad of excuses why they couldn't do that. So just in the Yemen situation, I forgot to put that map up. Anyway, it doesn't matter. You wouldn't recognize it anyway. But anyway, it's, so I say that in the Yemen situation right now, which is still ongoing, there are no winners in this war. There's only losers, and it's mostly civilians. The two sides have reached a military stalemate, and it's bleeding the country to death. There is no durable settlement on the horizon, and this will continue. Meanwhile, the needs are growing, the numbers are needing, and the money that we need is reducing because it's going to Ukraine or it's going somewhere else. And now the pressure is not on the Saudi Arabians to pay this. The 1 billion I got 3-4 years ago is now 250 million. They're starting to wash their hands of any responsibility for the humanitarian issue, which they've caused. That's the Yemen. Yemen, yeah. So if you can imagine a line through Sana'a across there, the country was split in two. The northern part was held by the Houthis, and the southern part is where the Emirates and the Saudis were basing themselves and using some breakaway groups. And then eventually, the old government came back and based itself in Aden in the south. Anyway, so I think that what we get now is a situation where, sometimes aid, in another situation, aid can be seen to exacerbate inequalities in the community. How you distribute aid, who you give it to, who designs the beneficiary list can have a major impact on how you perform in those areas. And sometimes you find warring parties, including the Houthis, would seek to try and leverage our influence or control who we gave funds to by saying you can't access that area, you can only access that area because that's where their supporters were. And that's something that we saw a great deal of. Often you would go to the Houthis to try and get them to give you access to an area inside the country. And they would only say, only if you let me see the beneficiary list, those people who receive the aid. And they would actually try and vet it for you, which is against our principles, of course. And it was very difficult for building trust with the Houthis. My first meeting with the military intelligence head in Sana'a, he said to me, oh, you work for United Nations of America. And so to try and explain to him they were neutral, we were in principle, all those usual stuff, he's like, yeah. But, because we were actually occupying a US embassy facility as our place where we stayed. We eventually left, but that's how we started out. So it was quite amazing. And also the UN, because of the 2216 Security Council resolution, which states quite clearly the Houthis must drop their guns and go back to where they came from, and the President Hadi must come back with his old government again. That's the Internationals' aim. So how can you go to the Houthis and try to build trust based on that part? It's just nonsense. Right, but sometimes we have to, it's not just about allowing aid to go in a humanitarian situation. Sometimes there's politics in blocking it as well. We saw, like in Syria, for example, you probably don't remember Syria, like 10 years ago it was the most intense thing and then reduced over time. But that there was somewhere where if your area where you wanted to deliver food was suitable for the militia or for Assad, they would let you do it, otherwise they wouldn't. So it's a common practice in any humanitarian crisis or conflict. That's what happens. You know, and then impartiality is something else, but it doesn't stop humanitarian aid from becoming one of the drivers of the conflict, because you can actually put a wedge through a community and create problems for yourself and create problems for them. It sometimes exacerbates the inequalities and actually can fuel conflict at local level. I mean, my example would be, you know, I remember being in Sierra Leone during the war. And I don't know if you remember Sierra Leone, it was a long time ago now, but it was a time when the tragedy was so, the type of barbarity you could see there. Anybody who voted or anybody who was a farmer had their arms cut off by the RUF. And so what you had was this bizarre situation when the war ended and the demobilization and the reintegration of child soldiers. The child soldiers who had macheted the arms of people who could no longer function were in a camp being supported, given psychological support, education support, other support. Meanwhile, the victims over here who were displaced in the community by these same people got about 1/10 of the support these guys did. And that caused a real issue. Both I saw it in Sierra Leone and I saw it in Liberia as well. Right, I'm going to go to, go into earthquakes. So I do that? Press the space bar to just say, oh, right, Nepal. Right. So Nepal, I was in Nepal. I was the head of the UN when the earthquake struck in 2015. You see Kathmandu, the earthquake didn't happen in Kathmandu. It happened 50 kilometers northeast and northwest, Sindabalchuk and Gorkha. But I would say that Nepal for decades, if anybody from Nepal here, okay, if not, I won't offend you. Nepal has always been the poster boy for development, and it's just fiction, absolute fiction. It was just basically an idea that it was all going great and everybody liked it, and there was a sort of boom to it. Development was working really well, but it was a Kathmandu bubble. It was inside Kathmandu. There was very little in the way of modernization or development outside there. And so when the disaster struck, everyone knew, because of the plates, everyone knew there was going to be tectonic plates, there was going to be an earthquake at some point. And so the donors, the member states, invested heavily in trying to have a disaster risk reduction preparedness strategy for it. It was just fiction. And so when the disaster struck, it didn't work. It really did. I think it found out, where are all these tools and where are all these systems? Nothing worked. So I decided to move all of the emphasis, not from Kathmandu, to move it to where it was needed. Kathmandu was the entry point for the goods, but the two areas, Gorkha and Sindabalchuk, 50 miles from where you had political opposition to the Kathmandu. And I moved the actual support to not central level, national government, to local government. And this caused a serious amount of problems. And so I had such a massive fallout with the government over that. And then over the fact that we bypassed the bureaucracy of Kathmandu and went straight to these areas. And it annoyed them because it changed the political dynamic for them, changed the power balance for them. And then the other thing they did, after 30 days, normally you leave a humanitarian response to go forever before you start to close it down. And the way to close it normally down is you start taxing the importation of humanitarian goods, food, shelter, all these things. And that's what the government did after 30 days, because they wanted to switch it back to the capital to get reconstruction done. So they went to the World Bank, and 2 months after the earthquake, they had a reconstruction conference, which is unheard of. So while people are still living in tents, they want to just build this big, giant flow of money. And that's what they did. So I came out and criticised them very, very heavily, publicly and in the media and on TV, so much so that the foreign minister went to Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General in New York during the G8, and asked for my removal. Thankfully, it didn't happen, but that's what can happen. These are the things that happen. So I think that you have to make sure that the aid we give is tuned into the local political dynamics, so you don't get sucked into this power play. It's sucked into the Kathmandu bubble, which was very, very easy to happen because it's simple, it's safe to work with the national government, who have no interest sometimes in working outside the capital because they want the resources for themselves or control over the resources for themselves. So that's important. You know, and I think that impartiality was actually put in place to try and remove politics from humanitarianism. And it's such a naive, idealistic, romantic notion. It's nice, but it's nonsense. You know, we're supposed to say impartiality is make no discrimination to nationality, to race, religious beliefs, class, or political opinion. And the idea is it's actually to define fairness. Oh, I'm giving it to that person because of that, you know. Anyway. But I think there's a certain moral blindness in it that goes on with it. And at that point I made about, if you go to a village where these young boys have massacred or maimed 500 people and families, you can't be seen to give them more than the victims themselves. And that's what the moral blindness of impartiality is. Anyway, okay, I'm going to move on to the next one, which is Palestine. Okay, there are two maps there. Palestine. Palestine, I know yesterday in the Security Council, Palestine was discussed. The Special Envoy Tors Wensland spoke to the crisis there right now. And he said it's a boiling point because what you've got is there's been a carte blanche given to settlers to take over as much of the land in the West Bank. You see the West Bank, that West Bank there. Gaza I'll come to in a minute, but the West Bank. So what you have is a situation, a humanitarian crisis, I think, is normally very politically charged because that's the way it is. There's normally conflict happens where people fall out, or you get more than me, so I'm going to fight for it. That's what happens. In the Middle East, Yemen and places like Palestine, these are, it's an intensity that you cannot imagine. And humanitarian discussions in these places like Syria, like Palestine, like they become the currency in the Security Council. So the Security Council member states are talking about access and delivery of assistance instead of talking about mediation and political resolutions. They don't do that. And so our work as humanitarians, I would say, has become almost like styrofoam or packaging for Security Council discussions. And that's not what should happen. I think the Israeli Palestine one is probably the one of the most intractable, and the humanitarian situation is, from my experience, the most complex and complicated and sensitive and the most entrenched. Oh, there goes Palestine. It's back again, isn't it? Okay, Palestine's back. And it's such a difficult place to work. I mean, it really was incredible. And it was partly difficult to work because Netanyahu was Prime Minister in Israel and Mr. Donald Trump was President in the US. So the chances of making any impact other than mitigating against failure was as best you could get. There were no wins in this environment at all. And Mr. Netanyahu is back, so watch that space. The dynamics in the situation that were not conducive to any development, any improvements there at all. So the humanitarian organisations and me were under complete scrutiny of two organisations, UN Watch and NGO Monitor. Every action, every word that you announced, it was scrutinised to the nth degree. The government supported these bodies to make sure if you stepped out of line in those eggshell moments and you crashed, they would have a perfect excuse not to deny your visa, to prevent you from accessing populations, to prevent your travel. And that's what they did. There are many of my colleagues who were pushed out and not allowed to come back or were never given renewed visas. And so it's something that neutrality is difficult to maintain in this very fever-pitched environment. You can't do it easily. And the result, you end up, what happens is people don't speak out. Because if you speak out and say something, oh, you're pro-Palestinian, you're anti-Semitic, you're BDS, whatever it might be. And so you're done. You're done. So what you end up saying is this dangerous silence that emerges. You don't say anything. You say enough just to be credible, but not enough to be critical. And that's the situation you find yourself in. Right. And my job was to remind all the parties to the conflict of their responsibilities and obligations under international humanitarian law and international law, to safeguard the welfare of all victims in the armed conflict. And, you know, the 1949 Geneva Conventions and the other provisions of the IHL, they're meant to be the cornerstone of our work. This is whereby we work. But you don't. You sort of hide them a little bit because you need to get on with the work. You actually compromise so you can get access to populations. And the thing is, the provisions in the IHL constitute legal obligations, not political obligations. And that's the way member states interpret it. It's not politically conducive for me right now to do that. But that's an issue. And so what I would say is, but on the ground in Palestine, you really have to switch off from being there, because if you don't, you get sucked into the injustice. You know, the fact that things are so harsh for everybody. You see people in the middle of Jerusalem getting their houses taken off them by thugs. I met guys in places like Hebron who were from Brooklyn, who were there to take houses off Palestinians. They came with this mission of being sent by, as if some sort of force of God coming. Anyway, but the obligations that they ignore is the reality, and it flies in the face of what they're supposed to do. So for more than 50 years, and it's still going on to this day, as I mentioned the Security Council yesterday, has this been this relentless consolidation and expansion of Israel and taking occupied Palestinian, confiscating land and houses in the middle of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, Sheikh Jarrah, or anywhere in the West Bank they want to go to. And I say, was that, and you know, it's incredible. I mean, you see it happening in front. It's like being on a TV. You see it happen in front of you, and you can do nothing about this. You can say nothing about this because, you know, back at headquarters, your headquarters people will say nothing because they're as terrified of being marked as anti-Semitic or anti-Israel or whatever it might be. So they're silent as well. And so the complicity allows this occupation to continue. Let me move to Gaza. I can't get that map up. How do I get that? Can people still see it? Oh, you can see it. Anyway, so let me see. Gaza. Perhaps, you know, one of the striking features of Gaza is, apart from the fact it's so difficult to get into, there's only one place you can go in, is coming in through Israel, or you can come in through Egypt. Only one door. It's the size of it and the density of it. There are about 2 million people in Gaza. 2 million people. It's 40 kilometers long, and in some parts it's only 6 kilometers wide. It's probably one of the most densely populated parts of the world, and there's limited space for the population to expand because of the Mediterranean Sea, because of Egypt, and because of Israel. And the infrastructure there cannot cope with the burgeoning population, cannot cope with the destruction that's taken place over the years of wars that have taken place between Israel and Hamas in there. They've destroyed so much of it. So you've got this water treatment facilities that are there. And it's interesting, you go down there, there's about 30 Olympic-sized swimming pools of raw sewage which get poured into the sea every day because the water treatment facilities cannot cope with the numbers of people who live there. They were built for a time past. You've got electricity supplied through the Gaza power plant, which is based on fuel donated by Qatar, and you get 12 hours a day if you're lucky. Sometimes the heat gets to 45 degrees in Gaza. It's a very, very tough place to live. And so the basic infrastructure in Gaza, the water, the electricity, the sanitation, they can't cope with the population. And then with all of these airstrikes that are taking place, and these airstrikes take place by Israel as a retaliation to Hamas rockets that go out into neighbouring Israel, Ashkelon and Ashdod and these places, and they see it as their security issue. And then the social services such as health and education are under serious strain. Did like that, obviously. 2 million people and 1 million people in Gaza need food support from other places. They can't live themselves. The economy is shredded. They have no jobs. There's a land and there's a sea blockade of Gaza by them. The fishermen, you have an international zone, 12 miles, and under the Oslo Accords it was given to 22 miles, I think. Gazan fishermen can't go beyond 6 miles because it's a threat to Israel. Israel's got gunboats. These guys give it fishermen boats and nets, but it's a threat, so they can't go there. And also Egypt helps to impose this blockade as well. And so that Hamas took control of Gaza in 2007, following a battle between Fatah, who are the party in Palestine, in the West Bank. And then, so what you had was this takeover, and then the situation is that this blockade's there. The way Gaza is treated by the international community is something we hope goes away, but it can't go away. There's 2 million people there. Hamas runs Gaza, and it's designated as a terrorist group by people at the US and some at the UK and others. And the aim of Hamas is to end Israel's occupation by any means possible. And Israel uses that. And Hamas has a large stock of weapons, and they use them, unfortunately, in throwing into the neighbouring areas, and civilians are caught up in that as well. There's a no-contact policy with Hamas imposed by these member states. But as a humanitarian, my job is to negotiate access with those people who control the territory, unfettered access. And so there's no point speaking to Israel if Hamas runs that territory. You've got to speak to Hamas. And if you get caught speaking to Hamas, which you have to do for that, if you get caught doing that, you get kicked out. So it's this fine line between doing that and not doing that. And let me tell you about Gaza. There's people in Gaza your age, all ages in Gaza. They wake up in the morning and they put on their phones or their internet, because they've got internet, and they see the world. And they know across, if you look at across Gaza, if you keep looking across there, you get to Cyprus and Italy and all these, but Mediterranean. They look online and they see people their age, 26 graduates, and they see, you know, the hopes, they see the weddings, the travel, the flying, the hotels, the cars, the jobs. You come to Gaza, you get nothing. There are no dreams, there are just nightmares. And so those young people sit there frustrated. Some escape and they end up in Europe. Some escape and end up doing other stuff. But the majority of people are stuck there and they cannot leave. And it's a really unfortunate situation. And when you try to find local partners and local organizations to work with, it's very difficult, because to live there, you have to have connections with Gaza. To exist there, you have to connect. But for us as humanitarians, if we find anybody who has worked with Gaza, is labelled close to Hamas, the donors will just switch your funding out overnight. That's what they do, because you're working with terrorists. That's what they'll do. Let me. And there's 2 million people in Gaza. There's no radiotherapy in Gaza. So if you get the need for radiotherapy as a cancer patient, you have to get out of Gaza to go to Jerusalem. To do that, you have to get permission from Israel. And to get permission from Israel takes a long time. The hit rate is about 60% on average people get out. If they find any allegation of you being connected to Hamas at all, they will stop that. A case I met, a 26-year-old woman who had breast cancer. She started a treatment, and for some unbeknownst reasons, Israel then blocked it, and she couldn't finish the treatment. And all she said to me, because I was doing a promotion on fundraising, she said, "Take me out in chains, tie me up," because she's got a 4-year-old son and a husband. She wants to live. Do that for me. That's what she said. And that's the situation. She said, "I'm not speaking for me, I'm speaking for hundreds of people like me who cannot get out to get the treatment they deserve, and they cannot get the treatment inside." There's a cancer ward in, the main hospital is Al-Shifa. There's a cancer ward there, and it's for children. And you go there, speak to the doctors, they're trying their best, and there's money coming from Middle East states to try and build some of these, expand and support these wards. You know, the doctor has to get the chemotherapy drugs from Israel or from Palestine, outside. He gets 5 doses, he's got 10 patients. So he says, "I have to play God." So he chooses the 5. And that's a normal thing. In the hospital, Al-Shifa, and the other thing, electricity, what happens is that the electricity goes off and the generators come on. The hospital generator comes on. But between the electricity going off from the power supply to the generator, there's about a 5-10 second delay. So people who are on ICU, people who are on, that oxygen, you have to pump with physical pump to keep them alive while it goes on. Sometimes it doesn't come on in 10 seconds. It takes longer. And that's a regular occurrence on a daily basis in those hospitals. And you try and bring that out to, you go to Brussels, you go to Washington, you speak to them, you say, this is the condition that people find themselves in. Children, women, it's not young Hamas guys, these are... 2018 was at Nakba, which was the Great March of Return. Nakba is a celebration time for the loss of land and stuff like that. It was 2018, that day, I think it was May the 18th, I was there in Gaza. And it was the same time when Ivanka Trump and her cohorts were in Jerusalem, moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, while Nakba was happening in Gaza. We had put up a lot of small hospitals, field hospitals because we knew it was going to happen, demonstrations would take place. So these young boys, young men, stand 200 meters from these berms, large hills with snipers. They fire the sling arrows and all that stuff, and they get shot. And the protocol shooting was seen that the shooting was of a certain type. It was normally lower limbs. So these people were getting shot anywhere between 100 to 200 meters away from the fence. They weren't threatening the fence, but they could threaten the fence. That was the rationale. So you saw that, and when you went to the hospital, I went the day it happened. We prepared all this. We knew it was going to happen. We had all these things set up. You go to the hospital, Al-Shifa. The car park was turned into a triage area. The people who came in through that door were women, men, children, and young men, not only young men. And when I went back to the Israelis and I spoke to the Foreign Affairs and told them this is what I saw, that they're adamant that these were young men threatening the fence, as it were, 200 meters, 100 meters away with stones. So very hard to stay, sane when you see that happening. I mean, you go to the hospital after, I go back on a regular basis, the reconstruction requirement for those people who have been shot, if you've ever seen a gun wound, the leg basically comes off, but then gets reattached again, and you need vascular reconstruction, you need cement, specialist treatment, which doesn't exist. So you have to bring doctors in if you get permission to bring them in. You can't get them out because they're young guys who are seen as a threat. And so when you go to the hospital, the smell of decay is quite extraordinary. And in the Arab world, a young man not having limbs or not being able to fend for himself is a burden on his family. So it's got real significance for that part of the world. So I would say that, the plight of the Palestinians, refugees since 47 and 49 and 67, are still without a just and durable solution. This is a political issue, and it's civil, and it's got political, national, economic, social issues as well. But it requires a resolution in line with international law. And there've been tens of Security Council resolutions on Palestine since the day one, and they've never been fully implemented, or they've been vetoed out. And so, as we do as humanitarians, we approach the crisis as humanitarians. So we come as a humanitarian solution. And that's what we've done as the UN for the majority of the time we've been there. But this is not dealing properly with the question of Palestine. This is just making us feel something, I don't know. And this can only be resolved if all the aspects in accordance with international law takes place. And the likelihood of that is so distant, given what's happening right now. And the new change of government in Israel right now, there is very little chance you're going to get a different approach or a different appetite from them. So only if there's a renewed political will by all sides, and I'm not sure that's going to happen, and the general adherence to international humanitarian law by Israel and the various Palestinian parties, as well as a commitment by the community of states to actually look for IHL to be properly adhered to and complied with. I personally have my great doubts about Palestine. And it's a tragic place that is only ever going to be more tragic, unfortunately. I don't have much time left. I've still got time. Okay. Right. So the latest crisis we mentioned is Ukraine. I don't have a map because the map's changing all the time because of Putin wants to change the map. We see the terrible human suffering that's happening, Kherson and all of these places, and the number of refugees you meet here and elsewhere. And, we've seen it already in Syria, Yemen, Palestine. We see it in all of these places. And But I think what it's done is, I think it's changing the way we work as humanitarians. I think this crisis is something different, unlike the other crises I mentioned, because I think what it is, many of the humanitarian organisations and the governments that fund us, because we get our funds from member states, then they want to step away from the humanitarian principle of impartiality, I think. Because that's dominated the way we've worked for the last 30, 40 years. That was one of our principles of partiality. But so now what you do is the humanitarian assistance is seen as political solidarity with Ukrainians, the Ukrainian government. And I think this is a dangerous path we've gone down. And then humanitarian aid is seen as an important part of Ukrainian resistance to Russian violence. So we party to that. And I think that, you know, a lot of the established humanitarian agencies and organisations, they would prefer to operate in political solidarity with the Ukrainian government because they see it as right. And it's not for us as humanitarians to judge right or wrong, it's judge need. And I think that that's a real worry. And so with the finances coming from the Western liberal countries, we'll have to follow suit if we want their money. And this is going to become a problem, as well as sometimes arms and weaponry is seen as humanitarian assistance in Ukrainian crisis as well, which I think is another really worrying development. And so what we see there is that the other thing I haven't mentioned is social media. Social media has become such a weapon in these crises. I mentioned Palestine, where I get bombarded by nonsense, but in the case of Ukraine, when you've got ICRC, Red Cross, and you've got the UN, these false flags that go up, and this by all sides, by the Russians and also by Ukrainians themselves, putting out messages anti that organisation because they weren't doing a certain thing. They weren't taking prisoners of war out of a prison and going somewhere else. They were helping move people to Russia. All of those complaints are there. And I think it's a real worry in that the instrumentalisation of social media against humanitarians is something we should fear. And I think that we can't just scale up and expand as we've done in other another crisis, because I think Ukraine is something different. And I think that the solidarity with Ukraine is well understood and I think it's well taken, but we shouldn't give into that to be humanitarians, because we'll be prevented from going to other parts by Russia. Like anything more to say I have, actually, okay, right. I'm going to come to conclusions, if that means anything to you. Right, I just wanted to sort of highlight theory, practice, law and application. And, you know, Dag Hammarskjöld was one of the first Secretary Generals of the UN. And he said that the UN was not created to take you to heaven, but was to save you from getting to hell. No, the other way around. It was, yeah. Anyway, again, doesn't mean very much. But I think the most useful thing the UN could do right now is to see whether it can do either. And I personally think there's some real challenges, not just the humanitarian part of it, as what I'm here to talk about, but in general, the part of it. You know, the reports of the UN's demise are regular. You know, this year, I think it's a new level, a new type of criticism that's come out here. And I think it's partly to do with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I think it's one of the most serious challenges of the 77 years of the UN. I think Russia's its active aggression. It's not the first time a P5, a permanent 5 member, has done that. But I think it's hard not to see that the UN is failing to constrain these permanent members to take that type of action. And when you've got threats of nuclear threats, and then at the same time you can see on real time the infrastructure of cities in Ukraine being bombarded as part of a war strategy, military strategy by Russia, a permanent 5 member. I think this is difficult. But I think, what can the UN do? I mean, we're only as good and useful as its members allows you to be. The UN doesn't have a voice itself. It's made up of those parties. So people say they always blame the UN, but the UN can only do what the member states let it do. And so you've got the 5 members, the Britons, those 5. They were part of the founding bargain of the UN when it first started, you know, and things have moved on. So Russia has the veto in the Security Council. So anything that criticises them, so it goes to the GA, General Assembly. They have resolutions. I mean, I wouldn't be critical, but it's like, they're not going to be implemented. They're basically advocacy. To quote Geoffrey Howe's, like, being mauled by a dead sheep, sort of thing. So I think that some people have adopted, there's observers out there who look at the UN and say that, especially writers from the P5 countries, those ones who are the most vocal, they have adopted a view that the UN is almost as outdated as the Security Council itself. And they say that it was never meant to do more than avoid big power wars post-World War II. That was its purpose. And it hasn't grown up since then. I think there's a lot to be said for that. We have not seen the system evolve properly over the last 7 decades to be something more meaningful and more appropriate for the times we live in. And I think that there's also the Security Council reform keeps getting put out there. We want to get India on board or Nigeria or change it. That's always out there. And this is just deflecting issues. Well, you know, why is Britain in the Security Council? What is it? Is it definitely a big power? Anyway, so I mean, Ukrainians are living right now, and all of these, they don't find solace in these arguments or these, you know, the suggestions that are there over the purpose of the UN or reforming the Security Council. But, you know, look at the Tigrayans for the last 2 years had no voice and nothing heard in there. And then the Palestinians who've had vetoes pushed upon them for decades. And there's other crises that have happened over the last decades who never even make it to the Security Council because some P5 member decides, no, we're not going to discuss that. That's not part of the agenda. So anyway, I'm going to try and finish on, I was asked to finish on some good news. So, I have a couple of pages still to go. I think that the good news is humanitarians, both the UN, the non-government organisations, the Red Cross, all of those people are doing good work. I mean, we reach as a collective about 100 million people a year who need support, assistance and protection. And I think it would be much worse but for the courage, the commitment, the professionalisation, the dedication of those people. But I'd also highlight the fact that most of the people that are doing the work are national, local staff, not internationals like me. I sit in the Capitol and point and do PowerPoints and give speeches and all that stuff. People who are at the front line are people who are affected by the crisis themselves. People who have lost family members, people whose family members are in prison, all of these things, and yet they still continue to do the work. And that's what we have to admire. But I think also humanitarianism is now a bit of a firefighting exercise with not a very big hose against a very big fire, a bit of a band-aid job. And I think we have to be better dealing with the real crisis, the reasons why conflict takes place. And we should try and look at the causes and try and resolve those problems rather than wait till something happens and then throw some bags of food at it or these type of things. Because otherwise what will happen is new crises will emerge. Who would have thought Ukraine? Who would have thought Ethiopia and Tigray? Who would have thought Afghanistan, pull out? I was in Afghanistan in June. Incredible. Who'd have thought Myanmar? After all that stuff, Aung San Suu Kyi was like, oh, here we go. The world's going to be a better place. Because we're not looking at these crises in the right way, politically, analytically, and looking at what are the dynamics below the surface, because we're happy with the surface. So, yeah. The SG said, Secretary General Antonio Guterres said a couple of weeks ago on a tweet, our world is in peril and paralysed. Good. And cooperation and dialogue are the only path forward. No major global challenge can be resolved by the coalition of the willing. And what he's saying, it should be the coalition of the world. And what he was hinting at was not the P5, it's the 188 other members who've got to have a voice to come out and say, we counter what you're trying to do because you're politicising the work of the UN. The Security Council, humanitarians elsewhere. So is the UN still respected? I think so. I think that can we, as an organisation, can we ensure peace and security? Some cases, maybe, doubtful otherwise. However, I get tired of all of these members, these leaders coming to the Security Council or coming to the GA every year and these lofty speeches about nothing. They just blah, blah about nothing, about what they do, what they think. And I think that we have to find a way of moving it forward. Otherwise, it's just going to diminish in front of our eyes. It's going to be continually used by the P5 to their own ends. I mean, the fact that Russia was given a platform in the UN to talk about Ukraine, I find it bizarre. You know, the fact that they can legitimise what they're doing there in the Security Council because they're part of the debate. And it was in February when Putin was launching his invasion into Ukraine, the Security Council with Russia in there was discussing Ukraine. How mental is that? And so I just think that, and it's not only that, I mean, the US have behaved badly as well. Look at Colin Powell and the chemical nonsense in 2003. That's there. And it's not just Russia, and also the Security Council. Look at China. I mean, the Chinese abuse against the Uyghurs, that report, that was kept in abeyance for years. And it was only when Michelle Bachelet, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, was leaving in August, she put it on the table and ran away. And so I just think we've got to get better at this. Okay, I am on the final page. So I think, me personally, I think the UN is needed. If it didn't exist, it'd be invented. I just think there has to be a platform where people, diplomats and countries can speak in a good way with one another within the realms of that body. And there's a certain protocol that goes with that. A meaningful change is possible. I think it is possible, but I don't know if we're going to make anytime soon any headway in that regard. And so every time there's a crisis like the ones I mentioned, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Myanmar, Ukraine, the UN doesn't send any of its political people there as the first step. Who do they send? The humanitarians. Because it's helpful and it's neutral and you're not taking sides, but you're getting used. I think that's unfortunate. So we have to find ways of making it work. And I would say that the UN, the legal frameworks and the international law by which I know you all study, we need to win that back. We need to win back that understanding, that acceptance, that compliance, that adherence, that respect. Otherwise, the relevance of not just the humanitarian work, the relevance of international communities' work in crisis is going to be, I think, undermined. And I think what we have right now is we could become extinct, you know. So just to finish, we need time to spend finding solutions and not excuses why it can't be done. And just to quote, as I always do with Nelson Mandela, it's always impossible till it's done.